Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
Wyoming High Country, 1878. For 5 years, Caleb Blackwood had sought a truce with God in the crushing silence of the mountains. He had traded the screams of dying men for the whisper of pines, convinced he had left the ghosts of the war behind in a shallow, unmarked grave. But on this morning, as the sun bled weakly over the jagged peaks, he learned that some ghosts have claws, and they follow. It wasn't a sound that woke him, but a wrongness in the air, a scent of profound violence carried on the wind. Against the roofline of his own cabin, a place he'd built with calloused hands to be his final sanctuary, was a silhouette, a grotesque ornament swaying in the dawn's breeze. He stepped outside, the frost-hardened earth crunching under his boots, and the full horror revealed itself in the pale light. A blonde woman, hanging motionless, her feet dangling inches above the words savagely burned into his door. Apache lover. The message was a brand, not just on the wood, but on her very soul. The smell of charred pine and pure vengeance was a physical thing, clawing at his throat. He had seen enough death to last 10 lifetimes, but this was different. This was a sermon written in fire and rope. He reached for a phantom weapon on his hip, a gesture his body remembered even if his soul begged to forget. As he drew closer, steeling himself for the grim task ahead, he saw it, a slight, almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest. She was alive. And just as that impossible realization struck him, the sharp crack of a rifle echoed from the distant ridge. It wasn't a hunter's shot. It was a statement. A promise. They were still out there, watching, waiting to finish their sermon. What unholy war had this woman dragged to his doorstep, and could he save her without resurrecting the killer he had tried so hard to bury? Part 1. Branded by Dawn. Sevens. The rifle's report was not a crack, but a flat, declarative sentence spoken across the canyon. "We see you." For a heartbeat, Caleb Blackwood was frozen, not by fear, but by a paralyzing sense of cosmic irony. He had fled a world of men and their wars only to have one delivered, quite literally, to his doorstep. The instinct screamed at him to retreat, to bar the door that was already so horrifically defaced, and let the wilderness reclaim its own. But the soldier inside him, the part he had tried to kill for 5 long years, was already assessing the situation. High ground. Single shooter, likely a scout. They were testing him, waiting for a response. He wouldn't give them one. He moved with an economy of motion that belied the turmoil in his soul. Snatching a hunting knife from its sheath on the wall, he was outside again in a second. He didn't look towards the ridge from which the shot had come. That was a rookie's mistake. Instead, his focus was entirely on the woman. He sliced through the thick rope with one powerful, upward stroke. Her body, limp and unnervingly light, slumped into his arms. He braced for the dead weight of a corpse, but instead felt the fragile resistance of a living thing. He half dragged, half carried her behind the cabin, away from the line of sight, his every nerve alight with a hypervigilance he hadn't felt since the Battle of Shiloh. He laid her down in the meager cover of the pines. Her skin was the color of old parchment, marred with a constellation of bruises that blossomed purple and black across her arms and face. Rope burns, raw and angry, chafed her neck. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, a testament to a thirst that must have been agonizing. But she was breathing. Shallow, ragged, yet persistent. Another gunshot echoed, closer this time, the bullet whining as it splintered a pine branch a dozen yards away. They were advancing. The cabin was a coffin, a target. He knew these kinds of men. Their hatred was a patient, methodical thing. They would surround the place and wait for him to emerge. He slung her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, her tangled blonde hair falling across his back. The scent of sweat, blood, and fear filled his senses. Ignoring the ache in muscles long unused to such burdens, he abandoned the cabin and its cursed door, melting into the dense forest that climbed the mountain's spine. He moved like a shadow, taking a winding, treacherous path towards a place he had found in his first year of exile. A small, hidden lean-to built into a rock outcropping near a stream, a place that even he sometimes had trouble finding. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves that wasn't his own, sent a jolt through him. He was no longer a hermit, he was a protector. And that realization terrified him more than any bullet. He finally reached the shelter as the sun climbed higher, casting dappled light through the canopy. It wasn't much, just a crude structure of fallen logs and rock, but it was hidden. He gently laid her down on a bed of dried furs he kept for the harshest nights. Her pulse, when he checked it at her throat, was a frantic, thready beat, a trapped bird fluttering against his thumb. He worked with the detached efficiency of a field medic. He fetched water from the stream in his canteen, tearing strips from an old shirt to clean the grime and dried blood from her face and wounds. As he worked, her eyelashes fluttered. A low moan escaped her lips, and she whispered a single word, a name that seemed torn from the deepest part of her. Chayton. It hung in the still air of the shelter, a ghost of a question. Then, she lapsed back into the fevered depths of unconsciousness. He sat back on his haunches, the adrenaline of the escape finally seceding, leaving behind a cold, familiar dread. Watching her, so close to death, so brutally marked by the world, cracked open a door in his mind he had nailed shut years ago. The smell of the charred wood on his cabin door was a key, unlocking a memory of another fire, another life. Suddenly, he wasn't in the quiet mountains of Wyoming in 1878. He was back in the Arizona Territory, 15 years prior. The sun was just as hot, the sky just as blue. His wife, Sarah, had laughed that morning, her hands covered in flour as she packed a basket. She was taking their 7-year-old daughter, Lily, to visit a friend in the nearby Apache settlement, a midwife who had helped deliver half the children in the territory, white and native alike. It was a peaceful place, a village that had signed every treaty and offered friendship to the settlers. But their land was good, and Corbin Sterling's cattle needed more grazing. Caleb, then a corporal in the army, had been ordered to patrol the border, explicitly told to keep the peace. But Luther Kane, a fanatic volunteer with the militia then, just as he was a fanatic hunter now, had his own orders, whispered from men like Sterling. The memory came in flashes of hellfire. The scent of kerosene. The screams that started just before dawn. Kane and his purifiers descended on the village with torches and rifles, fueled by whiskey and a righteous hatred that needed no justification. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. Caleb and his unit arrived to see the smoke, but it was too late. He had run, his heart a cold stone in his chest, ignoring the orders to stand down. He found them by the riverbank where they had tried to flee. Sarah was crumpled on the ground, a stray bullet in her back, her eyes wide with a surprise that would never fade. Beside her, Lily lay still, not marked by a bullet, but by the frenzy, trampled in the chaos. He remembered digging the graves with his bare hands until they bled, the sun beating down on his back. He had buried his rifle's trigger mechanism with them, a vow that his hands would never again be part of such a war. He had buried Caleb Blackwood, the soldier, in that grave too. A shiver racked his body, pulling him back to the present. He looked at the unconscious woman on the furs. Her face, even in its bruised state, held a fierce resilience. She was a survivor, just like him. He had run from the fire, and she had been thrown into it. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead, an act of tenderness that felt foreign and clumsy. Her fevered skin was hot to the touch. He trickled a little water from the canteen onto her cracked lips. Her throat convulsed as she swallowed instinctively. And then, her eyes snapped open. They were not the hazy, unfocused eyes of someone stirring from a fever dream. They were wide, blue, and blazing with pure, undiluted terror. She didn't see a savior. She saw a bearded stranger, another man in a world of men who had hurt her. Before he could speak, she launched herself at him, a guttural cry tearing from her raw throat, her nails clawing for his eyes. He caught her wrists, his grip firm but careful not to cause more pain. She thrashed against him, a wild animal caught in a trap, her voice a broken rasp. "No! Let me go! I'll die first! I'll die!" He had saved her from the noose, only to find himself wrestling with the ghost they had hung from it. The real battle, he now understood, had only just begun. Part 2. A Truce with Ghosts. Sevens, his name, spoken in a low, steady rumble, was the first anchor in the storm of her terror. "Easy now. You're safe." Serafina heard the words, but her mind, still trapped in the reek of smoke and whiskey breath, refused to believe them. She fought with the desperate, wiry strength of a cornered animal, her nails leaving red furrows on his leathered forearms. But the man, Caleb, did not strike back. He did not curse. He simply held on, absorbing her frenzy with an unyielding patience, his large frame a wall between her and the phantoms she was seeing. "The fire is out," he said, his voice calm, rhythmic. "The rope is cut. You're in the mountains. You're safe." He repeated the words like a litany, a prayer against the darkness in her eyes. Slowly, the fight began to drain out of her, replaced by a shuddering exhaustion that was bone deep. Her body went limp, her breath hitched into ragged sobs, and the world dissolved once more into a merciful blackness. The fever, which had been lurking in the shallows, now pulled her back under its burning tide. For the next 2 days, she was adrift. Time became a blur of fragmented nightmares and fleeting moments of lucidity. She was vaguely aware of a cool cloth on her forehead, the taste of bitter willow bark tea being spooned past her lips to fight the fever, the scent of roasting rabbit, and the constant, quiet presence of the man. He was a shadow moving at the edge of her fever dream, a guardian she could not yet comprehend. Caleb fell into the familiar rhythms of survival. He set snares, hunted with a quiet efficiency that left little trace, and gathered herbs with a knowledge gleaned from years of solitude. He moved through the forest with a ghost's tread, always listening, always watching, his senses honed to a razor's edge. He knew Cain's men were still out there. They wouldn't give up easily. A prize like her, a symbol of defiance, was too valuable to their cruel ideology. During the long nights, as she tossed and murmured Chayton's name in her sleep, he sat by the low fire, cleaning his hunting knife, his face a stoic mask carved from granite. He was tending to the daughter of a man he had every reason to hate, a man whose greed had set in motion the events that had orphaned his heart. Yet, Looking at her pale, bruised face, he felt no hatred. He felt only a profound and weary sense of duty. She was not her father's sins. She was a testament to them. Protecting her felt less like a choice and more like a reckoning, a chance to finally stand for something when he had once stood for nothing. On the morning of the third day, the fever broke. Serafina awoke to the sound of a crackling fire and the gentle weight of a fur blanket. The terror was gone, replaced by a wary clarity. She sat up slowly, her muscles screaming in protest. The man, Caleb, was sitting across the small shelter, sharpening the head of an arrow. He stopped when he saw she was awake, his hands becoming still. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence stretching taut between them. Her voice, when it finally came, was a dry, cracked whisper. "Who are you?" He set the arrow down carefully. "Name's Caleb Blackwood," he said. "This is my place, or what's left of it." He gestured vaguely towards the world outside. You found me?" He gave a single, curt nod. Her eyes fell to her hands, which were scraped and raw. She wrapped her arms around her chest, a gesture of self-preservation. After another long silence, she offered her own name, a thing she hadn't given freely in years. "I'm Serafina. Serafina Monroe." Sevens. The name meant nothing to Caleb, a simple fact for which he was grateful. He didn't want another connection to the world below. But his relief was short-lived. He offered her a tin cup of warm broth, and as she drank, her strength slowly returned, enough for the story to begin spilling out of her. At first, it came in halting fragments, disjointed memories of cruelty. Then, as if speaking of him gave her strength, she told him about Chayton. He wasn't just a lover, he was her teacher. He had taught her the language of the canyons, how to read the stars, how to find medicine in the earth. "He saved me," she said, her voice tight with unshed tears. "My father, Corbin Sterling, he saw me as property, a bargaining chip to merge his cattle empire with another. The last time he raised his hand to me, I ran." The name hit Caleb like a physical blow. Corbin Sterling. The cattle baron. The man whose insatiable hunger for land had led him to fund militias to clear out the native populace. The architect of the Dustwater raid. Caleb's hands tightened on the cup he was holding, the metal groaning in protest. He kept his face impassive, a skill learned in the war, but inside, a cold fury was rising. Serafina, lost in her own grief, didn't notice his reaction. She spoke of the years with Chayton as a time when she was truly alive, living under the sky, free from the gilded cage of her father's ranch. "They came for us in the winter," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the fire. "White men. I recognized some of them from my father's payroll. And the man leading them, he had cold, dead eyes. A man named Luther Kane." She flinched at the name. "They ambushed us. Chayton died protecting me. I saw him fall." She shook her head, a violent, jerky motion, as if to dislodge the image. "They dragged me back, called me a traitor to my blood. They said I was a lesson. They tied me to that post to make sure no other girl would ever dare to love a man they called a savage." Her voice finally broke, and a single tear traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. "You can hate me," she whispered, her eyes finally lifting to meet his. "Everyone else does." Sevens. Caleb said nothing. He stood up abruptly, the sudden movement making her recoil. He walked to the mouth of the shelter and stared out into the unforgiving wilderness. The rage inside him was a white-hot thing, a tempest of old grief and new fury. He wanted to hate her. He wanted to hate her for being Sterling's daughter, for bringing this war back into his life. He picked up his axe, the handle worn smooth from use, and began to split firewood with a ferocious, desperate energy. Each swing was a blow against the memory of Sarah's lifeless eyes, against Lily's stolen future, against Corbin Sterling's smiling, gentlemanly facade. He split log after log until sweat dripped from his brow and his arms burned with the strain. And then he stopped, breathing heavily, the axe buried deep in a round of pine. He looked back at her, huddled by the fire, looking so small, so utterly broken. And the rage subsided, leaving an aching clarity in its wake. He walked back and sat across from her again, his voice low and raspy. "I don't hate you." She looked at him, confused. "You think I betrayed my kind?" she asked, the question laced with self-loathing. "No," he said, his gaze as steady as the mountain itself. "I think the ones who say that have forgotten what our kind is supposed to be. Only a coward fears a soul brave enough to love across a line drawn in the dirt." Sevens. For the first time since her world had burned, Serafina cried without shame, the quiet, aching sobs of a grief too long held captive. A fragile truce had been forged between them, born of shared loss. That evening, as she slept a true, healing sleep for the first time, Caleb slipped out of the shelter. His instincts, now fully awake, screamed that something was wrong. Cain was not a man to be trifled with. He wouldn't send a simple posse and hope for the best. Caleb circled back, moving in a wide, silent arc towards the trail they had taken. He found the tracks near a dry creek bed. There were the heavy, clumsy prints of at least 4 riders. But there was another set, apart from the others. A single man, on foot. The prints were light, almost delicate, made by a man wearing moccasins, not boots. A man who knew how to move without being seen, who could read the land like a book. Luther Kane hadn't just sent thugs. He had sent a professional tracker. Caleb's blood ran cold. This changed everything. They weren't just hiding anymore. They were being hunted. He returned to the shelter as twilight bled across the sky, his face grim. Serafina was awake, watching him with questioning eyes. "Get some rest," he said, his voice devoid of the earlier warmth. "We move at dawn. They're not just searching anymore. They're tracking. And they're good." Sevens. Part 3. Where Serpents Lie. Sevens. They moved at dawn, 2 ghosts slipping through the pre-dawn gloom. The pace Caleb set was punishing, a relentless march that favored speed over comfort. He pushed them upward, into the treacherous high country, where the air thinned and the granite bones of the mountain broke through the soil. Every step was a calculated risk, designed to erase their trail. They waded through frigid streams, scrambled over rockfalls, and clung to narrow ledges that dropped into dizzying chasms. The soldier in Caleb had taken over completely, his focus narrowed to a single, sharp point: survival. This created a new friction between them. "Faster," he would command, his voice a low growl, when Serafina stumbled, her recovering body screaming in protest. She didn't complain, but he could see the exhaustion in the set of her jaw, the tremor in her hands. One afternoon, as they navigated a dense thicket of aspens, she suddenly stopped, holding up a hand. "Wait," she whispered. Caleb froze, annoyance flaring before he saw what she saw. A single, almost invisible tripwire made of sinew, set at ankle height. A hunter's snare, or a scout's alarm. With a nod of newfound respect, he watched as she expertly disabled it, a skill she had clearly not learned in her father's mansion. "Chayton taught me," she said simply, answering his unasked question. The moment passed, but it shifted something between them. He was not just dragging a burden, he was traveling with another survivor. Miles behind them, Luther Kane stood over the ashes of their abandoned lean-to, his face a mask of controlled fury. Beside him stood a man who seemed to be a part of the landscape itself. His name was Silas, a Cherokee tracker cast out from his tribe for working with white men, and he moved with a chilling, silent grace. Silas knelt, running his fingers over the faint tracks Caleb had tried so hard to conceal. "He is Army," Silas said, his voice as soft as dry leaves skittering across rock. "He knows how to hide, but he carries the woman. She makes him slow." Kane's lip curled into a sneer. "The daughter of Corbin Sterling, running through the mountains like a savage. An offense to God." He kicked at the cold fire pit, his obsession a palpable heat. His scout, the one who had fired the warning shots, approached nervously. "Sir, we've lost the trail at the river." Kane turned his dead eyes on the man, and the scout flinched. "We haven't lost anything," Kane hissed. "We are simply allowing the serpent to lead us to its nest." He looked at Silas, who was holding up a small, torn strip of blue ribbon he had found snagged on a bush. It was from the hem of Seraphina's dress. Kane took it, his fingers closing around the fabric as if he were strangling the life from it. "Find them," he ordered. Silas merely nodded, his gaze already fixed on the distant peaks, his expression unreadable. He was not driven by Kane's righteous hatred, but by the cold, clean logic of the hunt itself. After 2 days of relentless travel, Caleb found them a sanctuary. It was a shallow cave hidden behind the gossamer veil of a waterfall, the entrance shrouded in mist and moss. The constant roar of the water would mask any sounds they made and confuse their pursuers' senses. Inside, it was damp and cold, but it was safe. For the first time in days, they stopped. Exhaustion hit them like a physical blow. Seraphina sank to the floor, her body trembling. Caleb noted she was limping and, without a word, knelt before her. He gently removed her worn boots, revealing feet that were raw and blistered. His touch, which had been rough and impatient on the trail, was now surprisingly gentle. He cleaned the blisters with water from his canteen and applied a salve of pounded herbs, his large, calloused hands working with a practiced care. "My daughter," he said, his voice barely a whisper, breaking a long silence. She was always running off barefoot. Stubborn. It was the first piece of his past he had ever offered her, a tiny shard of a broken heart. She didn't press for more, understanding the value of the gift. She simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their shared geography of pain. In the sanctuary of the cave, with the world shut out by a curtain of water, they were not hunter and hunted, not savior and victim. They were just Caleb and Sarah, two people bound by a violence that was not of their making. The respite gave Caleb time to think, to plan. He couldn't run forever. He needed to turn the tables. He formulated a risky gambit, a trap using the terrain itself. He led Syrah to a high ridge overlooking a narrow pass, the only logical route for their pursuers. For hours, he worked, loosening rocks, creating the foundation for a controlled rock slide. He then laid a false trail, clear and easy to follow, leading directly into the trap's path. They hid themselves in an alcove high above, watching, waiting. Late in the afternoon, they appeared. Cain, Silas, and the rest of the posse, moving with grim purpose. They followed the tracks, just as Caleb had predicted. As they entered the kill zone, Caleb shoved a massive boulder, the key to the rock slide. It worked perfectly. A cascade of rock and debris thundered down the mountainside, blocking the pass completely. Cain's men scattered, shouting in alarm and confusion. Caleb felt a grim satisfaction. They had bought themselves time, perhaps days. He turned to Sarah, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. But she wasn't looking at the chaos below. Her eyes were fixed on a lone figure. The tracker, Silas. He had not taken the bait. He had stopped at the edge of the pass, his head cocked as if listening to a sound only he could hear. He ignored the false trail entirely. Instead, he slowly raised his head, his gaze sweeping the cliffs above, and for one terrifying, heart-stopping moment, his eyes seemed to lock directly onto their hiding place. He knew. The trap had failed on the one man who mattered. A cold dread washed over Caleb. They hadn't fooled him at all. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to take hold. They couldn't outrun a man like that. Hiding was useless. They were trapped. As Caleb's mind raced, desperately searching for an escape that didn't exist, Seraphina's voice cut through his despair. "There is a place," she said, her voice steady, determined. She was pulling a small, leather-bound book from her satchel, Chayton's journal. She flipped through the pages, filled with elegant script and detailed sketches. Chayton knew these mountains. He said the old ones believed they were alive. Her finger stopped on a crudely drawn map. It showed a network of tunnels crisscrossing the mountain. "The old sterling silver mine," she breathed. They called it the Devil's Maw. The company abandoned it 50 years ago. They said it was unstable, cursed. The map showed multiple entrances, a labyrinth of passages. It was a death trap. Or, it was the perfect place to make a stand. A place where a tracker's skills were useless, where the prey could become the hunter. Caleb looked from the map to the chillingly calm figure of Silas far below. The fear was still there, but now it was forged into something harder, sharper. Resolve. "He wants to hunt us in the dark," Caleb said, a new, dangerous edge to his voice. "He wants a sermon in fire and rope." "Fine." He looked at Sarah, and for the first time, she saw the soldier he had tried to bury look out through his eyes. "Let's give him a church made of stone and shadow. We're done running." Part 4. Into the Maw. Sevens. The decision, once made, settled over them with the weight of a shroud. There was no more panic, only a grim, cold resolve. Their flight from the waterfall cave was not a retreat, but a calculated advance towards the battlefield of their choosing. They moved with a newfound synchronicity, Caleb's woodcraft and Seraphina's knowledge of Chayton's paths weaving together into a formidable partnership. She would point out a nearly invisible trail marker left by Chayton years ago. He would choose the path that offered the most cover from a sniper's eye. They were no longer a soldier and a refugee. They were a single, determined unit. The entrance to the Devil's Maw was a scar on the mountainside, a jagged black wound gaping amidst a field of scree and stunted pines. The wind seemed to moan as it was sucked into the opening, a mournful sound that spoke of forgotten souls and utter darkness. Standing before it, Serafina felt a tremor of fear, not of the mine, but of the finality it represented. This was a place from which there was no easy return. Caleb placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that needed no words. He lit a single lantern, its golden glow a fragile shield against the oppressive blackness within. "Chayton's map," he said, his voice low. "It has to be true." She nodded, clutching the leather journal to her chest. "It is." Together, they took a breath and stepped out of the world of sun and sky, descending into the maw. The darkness inside was a living entity. It was absolute, suffocating, and cold, pressing in on them from all sides. The lantern's light seemed to be swallowed just a few feet from its source, creating a tiny, flickering island of safety in an ocean of black. Every sound was magnified into a threat. The drip, drip, drip of water from unseen stalactites, the scuttling of rats in the walls, the unnerving echo of their own footsteps. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decay, and something metallic, like old blood. They navigated by the faint light and Chayton's map, a treacherous process. Tunnels branched off in a bewildering maze, some ending in collapsed rubble, others dropping into black pits. More than once, Serafina's memory of Chayton's descriptions saved them from a wrong turn. He said to follow the vein of white quartz, the one that looks like a serpent's spine, she'd whisper, and they would adjust their course. Caleb, for his part, was in his element as a tactician. He wasn't just following, he was analyzing, memorizing the layout for the confrontation to come. They found the place Chayton had marked as the heart of the mountain, a large, defensible cavern with 3 distinct tunnels leading into it. It was a perfect kill box. "Here," Caleb declared. "We make our stand here." Sevens. For the next several hours, they worked with a silent, feverish intensity, transforming the cavern into a fortress. Using his knife and a rusty pickaxe they found discarded in a corner, Caleb directed the construction of their defenses. They rigged a tripwire at the entrance of the main tunnel, connected to a cascade of loose, heavy rocks propped up on a ledge, a crude but lethal welcome for their first visitor. They barricaded one of the smaller tunnels, leaving only a narrow crawl space that would force anyone entering to be vulnerable. The third tunnel they left open as a deceptive escape route, but Caleb marked the path with subtle notches only he would recognize, intending to use it to circle behind their attackers. Serafina, meanwhile, used her own skills. She found a deep pool of clear, cold water, solving their most immediate problem. She also identified a patch of phosphorescent moss, which she scraped onto key rocks, creating faint, ghostly markers that would be visible to them in the dark but likely missed by their pursuers. They were turning the mine into an extension of their will, a weapon forged from darkness and desperation. As night fell in the world above, they lit a small, smokeless fire in the deepest part of the cavern, the flickering light casting their shadows, long and dancing, against the stone walls. The work was done. All that was left was the waiting. The adrenaline subsided, leaving a space for the quiet, heavier emotions to surface. In the intimate circle of firelight, the barriers between them crumbled completely. "Caleb," Serafina began, her voice soft. "The daughter you mentioned, what was her name?" He flinched, the question striking a place he kept heavily guarded. He stared into the flames for a long time, the firelight reflecting in his haunted eyes, Then, he spoke. The story came out, not in a rush, but in slow, painful pieces, like a man pulling shrapnel from his own body. He told her about Sarah, his wife, whose laugh could make wildflowers grow. He told her about Lily, his 7-year-old daughter with eyes the color of the summer sky and a spirit as wild as the frontier itself. He recounted the day of the Dustwater raid in agonizing detail, his guilt a raw, open wound. "I was following orders," he choked out, the words tasting like ash. "I should have been there. My job was to protect them, and I was protecting a line on a map." Sevens. He fell silent, the weight of his confession hanging heavy in the air. Serafina didn't offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. She simply listened, her presence a quiet testament of understanding. Then, she opened Chayton's journal again, not to the map, but to the final pages. She showed him the detailed sketches Chayton had made. One was of a hawk in flight, another of her, sleeping by a fire. And the last one, the one that had been burned into her memory, was a hastily drawn but unmistakable image. Luther Kane, his face illuminated by torchlight, accepting a heavy bag of coins from her father, Corbin Sterling. "This is why he died," she said, her voice trembling with a cold, focused anger. "It wasn't just hate. It was business. Chayton saw them. He was a witness. My father paid to have him silenced, and Kane did the work with pleasure. It was all there, the motive, the proof. Her fight was not just for her life, but for the truth of Chayton's death." Caleb looked from the drawing to her face, and he saw the same fire for justice that had been extinguished within himself for so long. He reached out, his rough fingers brushing against hers on the page. It was not a gesture of romance, but of profound, shared purpose. Their ghosts had finally met, and they were demanding a reckoning. The waiting stretched into hours. The fire burned down to glowing embers. They sat in the near darkness, their weapons within reach, Caleb with his heavy hunting knife and axe, Serafina with a sharpened prospector's pick. Suddenly, Caleb held up a hand, his body going rigid. He had heard it first. A faint sound, a dislodged pebble skittering down the scree near the mine's entrance. It was a sound a normal person would have dismissed as the wind, but to him, it was a herald. They were here. He extinguished the last of the embers with the heel of his boot, plunging them into absolute blackness. They rose as one, moving silently to their prepared positions, their eyes straining to pierce the impenetrable dark. The sound came again, closer this time. A man's low curse, quickly stifled. They had taken the bait. They were in the maw. Caleb drew a slow, steady breath, the cool, damp air filling his lungs. He felt a strange, terrifying calm descend upon him. The soldier he had buried was fully awake now. He leaned close to Serafina's ear, his voice a ghost's whisper against the profound silence. Let the sermon begin. Sevens. Part 5. The Devil's Due. Sevens. The silence in the mine was a coiled serpent, and the sound of Luther Kane's voice was the hiss before the strike. "Spread out," he commanded his 4 men, his voice unnaturally loud in the confined space. "The tracker said they came this way. I want the girl alive. The man is irrelevant." Overconfidence was Kane's original sin, and the darkness was a humbling god. He held the only lantern, casting long, monstrous shadows that danced and lied, turning his own men into phantoms. The point man, a burly thug named Jonas, crept into the main cavern, pistol drawn. His boots snagged on a wire he never saw. For a split second, there was only a faint zing, and then a low rumble from above. Jonas looked up, his eyes wide with confusion, just as tons of rock and debris that Caleb had painstakingly prepared broke free. The sound was deafening, a roar that shook the very foundations of the mountain, a primal scream of stone and gravity. Jonas was buried instantly. Another man was thrown against a wall, his leg crushed and broken. The lantern flew from Cain's hand, skittering across the floor and extinguishing itself against a rock, plunging them into a chaos of absolute, terrifying blackness. The serpent had struck. From a narrow crawl space above, Caleb watched the pandemonium he had orchestrated. He moved with the lethal silence he had learned on battlefields where a single sound meant death. The remaining two men were panicked, firing their pistols wildly into the dark, their muzzle flashes brief, blinding strobes that only deepened the subsequent blackness. Caleb used these flashes to map their positions. He dropped down behind one man, a big, bearded brute, and struck hard with the flat of his axe against the man's temple. The man crumpled without a sound. This wasn't about killing. It was about dismantling the threat, piece by agonizing piece. While Caleb engaged the men, Serafina was putting her own plan into motion. From a different tunnel, she began to whisper Chaitin's name, her voice a ghostly, echoing lure. The last remaining gunman, a young, frightened kid named Billy, heard the sound. "She's over here!" he yelled, and, desperate for a target, he charged into the tunnel she had indicated, the one they had barricaded, leaving only a narrow opening. He squeezed through, and just as Caleb had planned, found himself trapped. Caleb was on him in an instant, disarming him and binding his hands with a strip of leather. It was almost too easy. But the true threats remained. Luther Cain was somewhere in the main cavern, and Silas, the tracker, had vanished. As Caleb secured the final gunman, he felt a sudden chill, a primal warning that he was no longer the hunter. He turned slowly. Standing at the far end of the tunnel, a silhouette against the faint light from a crack in the ceiling, was Silas. He held a long, wicked-looking knife in one hand. He hadn't fallen for the tricks. He had simply waited for the noise to die down, and then hunted the source. The duel that followed was a ballet of shadows. It wasn't a fight of brute force, but of deadly instinct. They circled each other in the gloom, the only sounds their soft footfalls and sharp, ragged breaths. Silas lunged, his blade a silver blur. Caleb parried with his axe handle, the impact jarring his bones. This was a fight on a razor's edge. Caleb couldn't see, so he listened, focusing on the whisper of Silas's moccasins on the gravel floor. He threw a handful of dirt and rock in the direction of the sound. Silas grunted, momentarily distracted, and in that instant, Caleb charged. He didn't strike with his blade. He slammed his body into the tracker, driving him hard against the stone wall. Silas's knife clattered to the floor. Before the tracker could recover, Caleb delivered a single, precise blow to his jaw. Silas slumped, unconscious. Caleb stood over him, breathing heavily, a strange sense of respect for the man who had almost bested him. One remained. Caleb retrieved the fallen lantern, and with a spark from his flint, brought the light back to life. He walked into the main cavern. Luther Cain was there, his back against the rock slide, his face pale and dirt-streaked in the lantern light, a feral animal cornered. "A soldier," Cain spat, recognizing the efficiency of the takedown. You fight for this filth? This race traitor?" He held a revolver, his hand trembling with rage. "She is an abomination. I am doing God's work, cleansing the land of those who would poison the blood of good Christian folk." Caleb advanced slowly, the lantern held high, his face an unreadable mask. "The only poison here, Cain, is you." He set the lantern down between them. "I was at the Dustwater raid. I saw your God's work. It looked like the charred bodies of women and children. It looked like my wife and daughter, buried in graves you made." Cain's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition, of surprise. "So, this is vengeance." Caleb shook his head. "This is a reckoning." Sevens. With a roar of pure hatred, Cain fired. But his eyes, accustomed to the dark, were blinded by the lantern's glare, and the shot went wide, ricocheting wildly off the cavern walls. Caleb closed the distance before he could fire again. The fight was short and brutal. Cain was strong, but his rage made him sloppy. Caleb moved with cold precision, deflecting Cain's frantic pistol whipping, twisting his arm until the gun fell from his grasp. Caleb kicked it away into the darkness. Now they were equals, just two men with their bare hands and their hate. Cain lunged, and Caleb drove him to the ground, straddling his chest. He drew his heavy hunting knife, the polished steel gleaming in the lantern light, and pressed the edge against Cain's throat. This was the moment. The culmination of 15 years of pain. The ghosts of Sarah and Lily screamed in his mind, demanding justice, demanding blood for blood. His thumb rested on the back of the blade, ready to push, to end the man who had architected his misery. But as he looked down into Cain's terrified, hate-filled eyes, he saw something else reflected in the blade. He saw Seraphina, standing at the edge of the light, her face streaked with tears and grime, her prospector's pick held in a white-knuckled grip. She wasn't looking at him with bloodlust. She was looking at him with a silent, desperate plea. She had seen enough killing. This was not the way. He looked back at Cain, a pathetic, trembling creature stripped of his righteous fury. Killing him now wouldn't bring Sarah and Lily back. It would only dig another grave in his own soul, burying him forever with the man he was in the war. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled the blade away. He raised his fist and brought it down in a single, clean blow that rendered Cain unconscious. He rose to his feet, his whole body trembling with the force of the choice he had just made. The violence was over. He looked at Sarah, the lantern light catching the exhaustion and the profound relief on her face. "No more graves," Caleb whispered, the words as much a promise to himself as they were to her. In the echoing silence of the Devil's Maw, surrounded by their defeated enemies, they had not only won their lives, but their futures. Part 6. A Trail of Wildflowers. Sevens. They emerged from the maw of the mine as the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold. They didn't look like victors, but like survivors of some great cataclysm. They were caked in dirt and blood, their clothes torn, their bodies a map of bruises and exhaustion. But as they breathed in the crisp, clean morning air, they stood together, not in triumph, but in a profound, shared silence. The war was over. They had bound their captives securely, Cain and Silas still unconscious, the other two men sullen and defeated. The journey down the mountain was slow and arduous, a grim parade led by two people who had earned their peace. They didn't ride into the center of Dustwater, the town that had judged Seraphina so harshly. Instead, they stopped at the small, unassuming house at the edge of town, the one with the neatly kept porch, the home of Marshall Evans. When Evans opened the door, still in his nightshirt, he found a scene from a fever dream. 4 bound villains, and the mountain man he'd been warned about, standing beside a woman who looked like a ghost from the grave. "Marshall," Caleb said, his voice flat and weary. "I believe these men are wanted for attempted murder, among other things." He dropped a heavy saddlebag at the marshal's feet. "And this," he said, nodding to Serafina, "is the evidence." Sevens. Serafina stepped forward into the lamplight from the doorway and presented Chayton's leather-bound journal to the stunned lawman. Evans opened it, his eyes widening as he saw the elegant script, the detailed drawings of plants, and finally, the damning sketch of Luther Kane and Corbin Sterling. He was at his crossroads, the weight of his conscience warring with the fear of Sterling's power. At that moment, a light appeared next door. The curtain in the general store window twitched, and Martha, the owner, peered out. She had heard the commotion. She saw the bound men, but her gaze lingered on Serafina, on her bruised face, her torn dress, her unwavering, defiant posture. Martha didn't see an outcast. She saw the embodiment of every woman's fear and every woman's strength. In an act of quiet rebellion that would change the town forever, Martha emerged from her store, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a thick woolen blanket. She walked directly to Serafina, ignoring the men, ignoring the marshal, and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. "You must be freezing, child," she whispered. That simple act of kindness was a spark in the tinderbox of the town's silent guilt. It was permission to be decent. Marshall Evans looked from the journal to Martha's brave gesture, and his decision was made. He straightened up, his face set with a new resolve. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice clear and firm, "bring your prisoners to the jail. They'll be held for the circuit judge." Sevens. News of the events at the mine and the capture of Kane's men ripped through Dustwater by noon. The town was buzzing with a mixture of fear and a strange, thrilling sense of liberation. The climax came when a furious Corbin Sterling rode into town, flanked by 2 of his ranch hands, his face a thundercloud. He stormed up to the marshal's office, fully expecting his wealth and influence to crush this inconvenient rebellion. "Evans," he boomed, "release my men at once. This is a private matter concerning my runaway daughter." The final confrontation unfolded not with gunfire, but with the devastating power of truth. Marshall Evans stood his ground on the jailhouse steps, flanked by a silent Caleb. And then Serafina stepped out, clean and dressed in a simple dress Martha had given her, Chayton's journal held in her hands. She faced her father, not with fear or hatred, but with a sorrowful strength. "It was never a private matter, Father," she said, her voice carrying across the silent street where townspeople had gathered. "It became a public matter when you paid for the murder of an innocent man." She held up the journal. "Chayton was a witness to your crimes. And now, so am I." She opened it to the page with the sketch and held it for all to see. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Sterling's face went from red to ashen. He was defeated, not by a weapon, but by a simple drawing and the courage of the daughter he had tried to break. The townspeople, who had once shunned her, now stared at him, their silence a crushing judgment. Corbin Sterling, the cattle king, was utterly alone. His power, built on fear, had crumbled into dust. Caleb and Seraphina had no desire to witness the legal aftermath. Their war was over. They collected their supplies, their movements synchronized and efficient. As they prepared to leave, Seraphina found Marshal Evans pressing a small, heavy pouch into her hands. "A bounty was posted for Cain," he said, a hint of shame in his voice. She gently pushed it back. "Keep it. Use it to build a better town." Their final stop was the ruin of Caleb's old cabin. The burned door stood as a grim monument to the beginning of their journey. As Seraphina waited on her horse, Caleb walked to the doorpost. There, pushing its way up through the ash and charred wood, was a single, impossibly resilient Indian paintbrush, its red petals a slash of vibrant life against the backdrop of destruction. He picked the solitary wildflower and walked back to her, pressing it into her hand. No words were needed. It was a promise of a new beginning, of life growing from the ashes. Months passed. The Wyoming high country healed itself, the seasons turning with a quiet, indifferent grace. Far from any town, in a secluded meadow protected by a ring of aspens and pines, a new cabin was taking shape. It was smaller than the last, built for two. The final scene is one of quiet, collaborative creation. Caleb, his face no longer haunted, expertly sets a foundation stone, his movements strong and sure. Seraphina, a soft smile on her lips, paints the newly hung door not with store-bought paint, but with a rich blue dye made from boiled wildflowers and berries. As the sun sets, casting a golden glow over their nascent home, her voice can be heard, a voiceover of her writing in a new journal. "I was once loved by a warrior who held my heart in his hands like a blade, fierce, bright, and sharp, with the weight of 1,000 battles. He taught me how to fight. Now, I live with a man who holds my heart like soil, soft, steady, and strong enough to plant something in. He taught me how to stay." They stop their work and stand together, looking out at the vast, peaceful mountain range. Caleb's arm rests gently around her shoulder. In front of their new home, a small, hopeful line of newly planted wildflowers follows the path to their door. They had survived the fire and the darkness, and in doing so, had not just found each other, but had finally, truly, come home. And so, the tale of Caleb Blackwood and Seraphina Monroe comes to a close. It began with an act of unspeakable cruelty, a woman left for dead, a message of hate burned into wood, but it ends with an act of quiet creation, of two hands building a single home. Their story is a powerful testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit in a land carved by wind and fire. It teaches us that the deepest scars do not have to be the end of our story. They can be the very ground from which a new, more resilient life can grow. We learn that true justice is not always found in the thunder of a gunshot, but in the unwavering voice of truth spoken against a wall of silence, and that real courage can be as simple as a kind woman offering a blanket to a stranger. Perhaps, most importantly, we are reminded that love itself has many seasons. There is the fiery, passionate love that teaches us how to fight for who we are, and then there is the quiet, steadfast love that teaches us how to stay and heal. Caleb and Seraphina, two souls once broken by the world, found in each other not a savior to be worshipped or a victim to be pitied, but a partner to build with. They chose not vengeance, but peace, not a shared past of grief, but a shared future of hope. They prove that even in the harshest wilderness, the most beautiful things can bloom from the ashes. Thank you for joining us on this journey across the untamed frontier of the human heart. If their story of courage and second chances moved you, please help us share it by liking this video and sharing it with someone who believes in the power of healing. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of love that outlasts the deepest scars. And in the comments below, tell us, what does a wildflower growing from the ashes mean to you? We'd love to hear your story.